Hello, welcome to FightCore USA.
So you're fighting this guy, right? And you figure out his stance. You'll know whether he's an orthodox fighter, a southpaw, and you even know if he switches stances. But what if he switches back and forth between stances at will, seemingly at random? What if sometimes he comes forward in an orthodox stance, and suddenly the next moment he is coming at you from a southpaw stance, or vice versa? This is something that completely changes the landscape of a fight, because now all of the angles are different. All of a sudden there is no longer a discernible pattern to his movements, and it becomes extremely difficult to know what is coming next. This is obviously not a beginner-level tactic, and it is something that only the most seasoned and high-level fighters have ever picked. And even then, it's not done very often, but when they do, it can be absolutely devastating. So let's take a look at why switching stances randomly is the ultimate form of confusion. Now, when we talk about stances in combat sports, we usually refer to two basic stances: the orthodox stance and the southpaw stance. Now, these terms actually come from boxing, but they apply to any combat discipline where a person fights with their dominant hand down and to their non-dominant hand up. If you're fighting someone who has their right hand down and left hand up, they are in an orthodox stance. And conversely, if they have their left hand down and right hand up, they're in a southpaw stance. Now, of course, there are more nuances to fighting stances than just the placement of the hands. For example, Muay Thai fighters will generally have a wider base with their hands in a higher guard. And some fighters might switch stances depending on whether they are the aggressor or the counterpuncher. But for the purposes of this discussion, we are going to focus on the basic concept of a fighter who switches between being an orthodox fighter and a... One of the reasons why a fighter would want to switch stances is to throw off their opponent as time in. Of course, this is not an easy thing to pull off, because it requires a lot of flexibility and body control to switch from one stance to another seamlessly. But when a fighter does it correctly, it looks effortless, and it can be extremely effective. Let's say that you're fighting an orthodox fighter. In this case, the opponent's right hand is down and left hand is up. You might observe that the majority of his punches come from his right hand, which is the hand that is closer to his body and therefore easier to use. His left hand, which is extended forward, is used primarily for jabs and other quick, sharp strikes. By fighting out of an orthodox stance, he is able to keep his right hand close to his body and use it to generate the majority of his offensive output. As a defender, you can exploit this by attacking his lead leg with kicks or by targeting his left hand, which is more vulnerable because it is further away from his body. When your opponent switches to a southpaw stance, however, things change dramatically. Now his left hand is down and right hand is up, meaning that his weaker hand is forward and his bar hand is behind him. This makes him much more vulnerable to attacks from the other side, especially from his lead leg. If he tries to attack with his left hand, while in this compromised position, you can easily block or catch that punch and punish him severely. In addition to changing the angles of attack, switching stances also completely changes the way that a fighter moves. For example, when an orthodox fighter throws a straight punch, they usually step forward with their left foot as they extend their right arm. This not only helps them generate more power behind the punch, but it also gives them a wider base of support. As a result, it is more difficult for their opponent to knock them off balance with a well-timed kick or takedown attempt. A southpaw fighter, on the other hand, will reverse these movements. They will step back with their left foot as they throw a straight punch with their left hand. This makes it much more difficult for their opponent to predict their movements, and it also makes them less predictable, because now their lead leg is further behind them, and they have less of a base to support their punches. This means that it is much easier for their opponent to disrupt their rhythm with a well-timed attack. So you can see how switching stances completely changes the way that a fighter moves, and how it can make them much more difficult to defend against. But the real genius of switching stances comes when a fighter switches back and forth between the two stances seemingly at random. When a fighter switches stances back and forth during a fight, they are essentially fighting from two different angles simultaneously. This makes it impossible for their opponent to develop any kind of timing or rhythm, because every time they think they have figured out the pattern, the fighter switches things up again. It's like trying to solve a puzzle that keeps changing pieces. For example, let us say that you are facing an orthodox fighter who likes to keep his distance and jab with his left hand. He occasionally switches to a southpaw stance. But you are able to deal with those moments because you anticipate the change and are prepared for it. However, if he starts switching back and forth between the two stances randomly, it becomes much more difficult to defend yourself. One moment he may be standing in an orthodox stance, throwing quick jabs from his lead hand while keeping his power hand safely tucked away behind him. The next moment he could be in a southpaw stance, switching his hands and changing the angle of his attacks. On top of that, he might throw in some movement to make things even more difficult to defend against. What makes this so challenging is that the fighter is now operating from two different sets of angles. This means that you have to constantly be on guard against both the orthodox and southpaw attacks, never knowing when the fighter will switch stances again. It's like having to fight two different opponents at the same time, each with their own unique set of skills and techniques. The only way to deal with this type of fighter is to be equally unpredictable yourself. But this is easier said than done. After all you do on one to be known as the unpredictable fighter, because then your predictability becomes your unpredictability. So how do you beat a fighter who is always switching stances? The answer lies in adaptability. You need to be able to read the fight and adjust your game plan accordingly. If your opponent is a southpaw, you need to be able to defend against that. But if they start switching stances, you have to be able to adapt to those changes and defend against the new angles that they present. One way to do this is to focus on the overall shape that the fighter is presenting rather than his specific hand placement. For example, if the fighter is standing with his hands down, his body leaning forward, he is presenting a target that you can hit regardless of whether he's in an orthodox or southpaw stance. Another way to deal with a switching stance opponent is to focus on the head and to ignore the hands entirely. After all, the head is the most important target in any combat sport. And if you can focus on keeping your eye on the head, You will be able to react to any changes in stance or angle. But this takes a certain level of experience and intuition that only comes with years of training and competition. The bottom line is that fighting an opponent who switches stances randomly is a difficult task. It requires a high level of adaptability and the ability to read the fight and adjust accordingly. However, when you do figure it out, it can be extremely rewarding.
Okay guys, thank you for watching my videos.